Hello, and thanks for listening to the Adulting is Easy podcast. This is Lauren, and I manage the Adulting is Easy blog and podcast, which can be found at realadultingiseasy.com and anywhere you listen to podcasts. Please take a second and hit the follow button wherever you're listening if you can safely do so. I'm joined today by Justin Nacpil, the host of the Road to Wealth podcast. He's a Midwest husband and father of 2 young boys and works in the technology space in sales. Justin started his podcast as a way to share financial stories from everyday people. Thanks for joining me, Justin.
Of course, Lauren. Thanks for having me on.
I'm excited. And our goal for today is to make adulting a bit easier for our listeners by discussing a personal finance topic, since managing money is a huge part of adulting. Today, Justin and I are going to talk about something he's learned from the Having a Personal Finance podcast. So why don't you tell us, Justin, what made you start the Road to Wealth podcast?
Great question. For me, it was a COVID baby. And as we've probably seen, Lauren, through our peers online, it was a very difficult time, obviously, just externally with a global pandemic and just like navigating life. And, throughout the past years prior to that, I was consuming a lot of personal finance content, podcasts, books, and it was really kind of destined, I feel, because I needed to do something because I wasn't seeing humans. And this was kind of my way of talking to strangers about money. So this was, it was definitely an experiment for sure. And, we're actually, now we went through 2 seasons in all of 2021. So I kind of split it up in half years. So I'm right now kind of outlining season 3 as we start out this new year in 2022. So it's been a fun journey so far.
That's awesome. Yep. I think a lot of people started things during COVID that they maybe kind of were subconsciously bouncing around in their brains, and they all kind of came to life. So I think that's awesome.
Definitely.
So were you into personal finance then before that?
I always thought about money growing up as a kid, and, this whole concept of, what does rich look like? Kind of lifestyle. I ironically grew up with a finance degree coming out of college, which I didn't use. And as a fellow millennial, Lauren, I graduated into the Great Recession. So
Yep.
No one was hiring finance people coming out of college. And, you just kind of live life. And I ended up, stumbling my way into a sales career. I think no one really goes to school personally for sales. That's just my opinion. But yeah, I've always been interested in it. And I think what fueled it, especially recently, going through adulthood, was pretty much the amount of debt that my wife and I carried into our marriage. So that helped kind of trigger this whole journey of stepping into the personal finance space and just also learning about other people's stories. It was actually pretty interesting, kind of our journey through that process.
It is amazing. I really do love podcasting for that reason. Mm-hmm. Just getting to talk to people, learning new things, and really realizing there's no one size fits all approach to personal finance.
For sure. Absolutely.
And it's interesting how our paths are so similar, because I too graduated during the Great Recession with a finance degree and ended up in sales.
So that's why it's been awesome getting to know you. And, also because you also have obviously a different approach when it comes to, how you're building wealth. And shameless plug, I got a chance to interview you on season 2, episode 7 last year. So I think we're come full circle. So it's an honor being on here.
Yeah, payback. Now you got to talk to me.
Definitely. It's my honor, for sure.
I know. I love it. I just love doing this. I love learning from people. And it's always so interesting because I feel like no matter how different the finance approaches are or the personalities are, I'm always able to find some things that I have in common with my guests, for sure.
Yeah.
So why do you think people should listen to your podcast or my podcast or learn about personal finance in general?
I think it is one of those milestones within adulthood that you just either have to learn or you just somehow stumble into it. And I feel like, for us being, in sales and, being proactive, or, you don't have to necessarily be in sales. It's just one of those things where life comes at you fast. And what triggered it for me was a layoff, actually, that I experienced at a sales job in 2016. But I think to kind of set the stage for your listeners, when you, at least growing up in, I'm in the Chicagoland area, I am Asian American, I'm Filipino American specifically. And within our culture, there's always this element and narrative of hitting certain life milestones. Like you have to graduate with a 4-year degree, have a high GPA, marry your high school sweetheart or something equivalent, right? Get a house, have kids. And, that was such an emotional thing for me to navigate and check those boxes of adulthood. And it all happened to me in 1 year. And I don't know if I shared this with you offline, Lauren, but so I got married in 2015. We found out we were pregnant right away. We rushed to get a house, got a house in 2016. We had our child, and I was laid off all within a 10-month period from 2015 going to 2016. And that was a very sobering moment for me, just because when you're going through these milestones and society and your family's telling you like you have to hit these milestones, when it comes crashing down on you and not having an emergency fund or any form of safety net, that that feels a lot. And as a father, that really fueled me. So I felt that digesting this content, finding folks like yourself, reading all the books in the world to get us out of our situation was a big thing for us. And it's funny because I was going through archives of um, our debt payoff, and naturally we use Dave Ramsey. He's obviously the loudest voice within the space.
Yeah.
And I looked at an old picture I took of our debt snowball, and all in around that 2015 2016 timeframe, we had about $52,000 of debt,
Wow.
which was crazy. We had cars, we had credit cards. We had credit cards that we bought. We opened up because we wanted to get a washer dryer and furniture. And these,
Yeah.
in our minds, were just things that we needed to. We just thought was a part of life. And right then and there, we're just like, enough. So, I don't know. Kind of circling back to your question of why you feel it's important. I feel like, at least for us, this was the triggering moment of going through a layoff and having that number that we had to stare at was really the crux for us. So
And that's all it takes if you don't have an emergency fund to make really big problems for yourself, right?
yeah, totally. And we had a little bit of an emergency fund. I had some stock, that I kind of fell into, but it wasn't necessarily this thing where it was intentional, nor did we have a plan. It was more so that we brought together, like, prior to my wife and I getting married, we had the "you show me your debt, I'll show you mine" kind of conversation. Like, Ramit Sethi talks about being financially naked in front of your partner, and we did that exercise. So having that moment was just like, my gosh. Um, but yeah, I mean, I don't know if you had a similar one, or not. I'm sure you've featured different stories of people getting out of debt and building their wealth, but those are very key moments, I feel, with adulting.
Yeah, I had J Rod come on, and so he talked about them being in debt and financing a repair to their house. Didn't even
Hmm.
think twice, right? Kind of like what you're saying about I'm getting a washer and dryer. I should open up a Sears credit card or
Hmm.
whatever, right? Like that's what you
Yeah.
do when you need to buy these things. Or like when I met my husband, he had financed a TV on his Best Buy card. Like that's
Hmm.
just like a very normal thing that you really truly don't think twice about it. And it normally does take kind of a moment like you're talking about, where you just kind of get jarred out of it. So you guys didn't have any student debt then, just pretty much credit cards, cars.
My wife had a little. She had a small amount of going back for a nursing degree, which she didn't finish. But yeah, it was mostly just consumer debt. We were avid spenders. My wife and I can certainly tell you, we allowed lifestyle creep to impact us in our 20s. And yeah, I just wish, you always talked about, you wish you invested earlier, and I wished I knew about a Roth IRA. But these are things that aren't unfortunately taught to us in a financial literacy course or anything around. Like, we see how people operate when it comes to, like, oh, the shiny new iPhone or the shiny new car, but we never understand the boundaries that we need to place for ourselves prior to getting those purchases. So
And I never had one of those moments per se. Um, there was some addiction in my family, and my parents had a kind of an unexpected kid who I love. That's my little sister.
hmm.
And so when I was in my teens, I was like pretty much left alone. And I think what that actually did for me was make me feel like I needed to be able to take care of myself at like all costs. And so I, even from very early on, felt like I needed to have a financial, like at least some financial stability to fall back on if I ever needed it. And so I like just, I've literally always been a saver. And then lucked into my first house, right? I bought my first
Hmm.
house in 2012, like just be literally because it was a cheaper payment than if I would have had an apartment. Like it wasn't like some brilliant prescient move that I was, that I had. And so that is where I got some access. I kind of think it was accidental net worth. And then I started thinking, well, what if I tried to do something on purpose? And the rest is history, if you will.
Yeah, and for your listeners, I think that's why Lauren and I have become great virtual friends, is because I'm the youngest of three. So the way Lauren talked about her younger sister, I looked at the same reverence that her younger sister looks at her to my brothers, and in a way they felt a little bit of pressure to provide a similar type of model for me. But being the youngest, sometimes you don't want to listen, or even though they're there to give you guidance, you need life experience to kind of throw at you. And I felt like
Yeah.
things like growing up and going through a layoff were definitely those moments and lessons for sure.
So you talked about society having these milestones laid out for you, and you mentioned kind of your family and your heritage, I guess, having these milestones laid out. What did your brothers, what did your parents, what happened with all of that when, okay, you've got the wife, you've got the kid, you've got the house, and then you don't have the job? Was there, like, what happened when that happened?
Oh, I mean, all the shame, personal shame that you could put on yourself, right? You kind of, there's always this term, especially in the corporate space, that we talk about being an imposter. And it was actually the first time that I felt like an imposter as being in the family. Because it is, there's an element of shame that you kind of carry, because, you now have these responsibilities, you have a child, and you have to figure it out. And it's also kind of your moment and opportunity to really demonstrate that you're an adult, and having to navigate through that. So that was definitely tough. um because even in our society, we it's at least for within my family, like, I'm sure my mother wasn't like, oh, how's your son Justin? Oh, he's looking for a job right now, right? Like, I felt a lot of shame that I carried with that. So I mean, thankfully the layoff was brief, but I went through going through unemployment, and having to apply for that. Like, all those things just felt so disgusting to me. And um although brief, it was definitely something where, like, on the financial side, I had to make sure I never felt that feeling ever again.
What were some of the first things that you did? Is that when you turned to Dave Ramsey?
He was already in our, if you want to say, ear. I was already digesting a lot of his content, and I read the Total Money Makeover, so we were already on that plan. I think the element of getting a new job was just the fire, really, to do that. And we paid that off, fairly fast. I think probably by 2017, mid up to 2018, we paid it all off. And we had another kid, and that's where I found financial independence, retire early, and that crowd. So I felt
Yeah.
like the evolution of personal finance, you start with one character, and then you build. And that's been really the nice thing of this community so far.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've said this before. Jamila was another one of my guests, and she paid off $83,000 of student loans in 3 years.
Wow.
And I think often the people that start in debt are so well suited going forward once they learn the personal finance, some best practices, once they start paying down their debt, because once that debt payment's gone, I don't think they then let lifestyle creep happen. They take that money and they start investing it.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm not sure if it was the same for you, but like, one staggering image I always had, Lauren, was I was a traveling salesperson, and I would always see, like, in first class, or the seats that were closer, to the cockpit, these older salespeople, or people in suits, and or business clothing, either overweight or stress eating. And that was always like an image that I didn't want. And in some ways, they also demonstrated their wealth with their watch, or the nice shoes that they had. And I recognized that as they were getting older in age, that was one thing I didn't want to become. I didn't want to become, quote unquote, that stereotypical salesperson or person on the road that was just getting a paycheck so I can either inflate my lifestyle, or just maintain the, with very thin margin, the luxuries of life versus actually living it.
That's definitely what happened with me. Is I started to feel like I made it, right? Was making good money,
Mhm.
traveling 2, 3 times a month, got the dream house and the golf course community, was
Mhm.
considering joining the country club, had the BMW,
Mhm.
and then like literally ran some numbers, you know? And I couldn't retire until I was like 55.
Mhm.
And and that was like with saving a lot, like a lot of money still, right? And I
Mhm.
still couldn't retire to 55. And that was when I was like, this is not right. Like, because I was doing the same things that you're talking about. Like, this is what you do. Now, I kept my first house and rented it out. So, but that was the only way that I was different from any of my peers. All of them just would have sold the house and bought the new one. And I did keep it and rent it out. So that's kind of where things started for me. But it is so interesting that people just fall down this path and you just think it's the right thing. You're like, sure, you're not even thinking, you're like, sure, you're doing the right thing. You don't even question
Yeah.
that that you're not making the right moves.
So I have a question for you, Lauren.
Mhm.
I'm sure many listeners know that you not necessarily fell into house hacking or called it house hacking at the time with that first property. Did your friends actually recognize what you were doing with that first investment property where you lived in one part and or had a roommate and whatnot? Did they actually fathom what you were going through?
I don't think so. I mean, it was weird because I was like 22, 23 when I bought my first house. I went
Hmm.
under contract at 22 and then turned 23 before I closed on it. And it was weird. It's like, okay, Lauren has a house, but I don't think they thought anything of like me having the roommate as being like a fantastic financial move. It was just like this was a guy that I had lived with in college was my roommate. So it was like we were
Hmm.
kind of like literally just like a friend. But it was like kind of like we were just kind of continuing the lifestyle that we had lived at school is kind of how it's even probably how it felt to me at the time. So I don't think anybody thought it was like a great financial move or something that they should do.
Interesting. Yeah, because like I'm thinking myself at like 22, 23, right? Like, if I've been to St. Pete's, right? I've been to Tampa. So like in my mind, if I was quote unquote adulting and had the big job and the BMW, like, I'd be all over International Plaza trying to shop or, go to across the bay to St. Pete's Beach and, buy rounds of shots. Like that to me would be the equivalent, but in Chicago, right? And I just didn't have that mindset in place because I never saw investment opportunities such as real estate. It was just one thing that I felt because I deserved, if you will, and I hate that word now, was back in the day was just like I finally have a job, I'm adulting, I have an apartment, I'm living in the city. I should be able to afford that, nicer car or whatever. And I never really analyzed my finances and took a financial look in the mirror, if you will, to see if it was the right decision. So
Well, I partially at that time didn't have a choice. And you want to talk about shame, right? Like I graduated with a 3.94 GPA from the University of Florida and went to work at Toys R Us. And that's where
mhm.
I was working when I got that house. And I was driving my first car that my dad bought me when I was 16, a Ford Focus, right? Like this is where I was. So there was no moment then where I felt like I deserved anything. I actually felt like very like bad about the
Mhm.
direction my life was heading. And I went from, living in my parents' house on the water in St. Pete to working at Toys R Us. Like it felt like this fall and I felt like I was at the bottom. So there was no, I deserve this until later. Right.
Mhm.
Then I did accounting for a year. Then I got into sales and I started making good money. And then I did the treat yourself thing just a bit too much. And then I realized, oh, that 22, 23-year-old Lauren who had the roommate, that was actually smart. And I'm going to do the slightly more grown up version of that and get a house hack and actually try to get out of the rat race before I'm in my 50s or 60s.
You see, I think your subconscious was kind of talking to you there, Lauren. Like, I think that, subconscious Lauren really, saved you in a lot of ways.
I know, and you know what I distinctly remember thinking when I was in accounting. So I was like 24, I guess.
Hmm.
And I remember thinking, I am working for myself when I'm 24 and when I'm 64
Hmm.
was kind of how I thought about it. And so that was the first indication where I was like, I have to really truly be saving. And my dad explained Roth IRAs to me. He had already explained 401ks to me. And so that's when I put my first 3,000 in a Roth IRA at Vanguard was when I was 24. I already had the
Wow.
house and I was saving for a car again, because like my first car was getting old. at
Mm.
that point, and it's a Ford. I loved it, but they don't last forever.
Mm.
So I was saving for that car, but I was like, you know what, I need to start saving for retirement too. So I was really lucky. But it really all did come from fear at first, because I really felt like I needed to take care of myself. Like my parents were taking care of my siblings, and I had to take care of myself. And I couldn't do that if I didn't have, a pretty sizable, for my age, emergency fund. Like I was like, Lauren's going to take care of herself, and I'm not going to let anybody else take care of me, which
That's
really
amazing.
wasn't the right mindset. It's not true. My parents would have stepped in at any moment, but you know, this is what it's like being the older one. It kind of blows my mind. You're like I think of it as the Jenny. You're like my sister. You're
Well,
the
that's the
young one.
thing is, like you should say that with a lot of confidence because, I'm sure your younger sister is probably looking at you in the same lens that I looked at my brothers, right? Where, I had to allow life to make me realize that they're figuring it out too. And it's funny because like now I have a relationship with my family where I am now the podcaster money guy, so I should know everything. But it's in the same fashion, like, I've recognized with parenthood is this just like you will have to allow life to give you these experiences for you to figure out and then you can share your story. And that's what I've essentially pivoted with the podcast is that everyone's financial story is different regardless of you got your first investment property or you know made millions on a shit coin on GameStop or whatever. Like
Yeah.
everyone has a unique piece and not every journey or story to to wealth is the same. And I think that's what I've really recognized, and as well as many other lessons on interviewing folks like yourself. So
That was one of my questions was, do your friends and family know about the podcast and your personal finance journey, and how do they feel about it? What do they think about it?
it's a mixed bag. Like I kind of carried a little bit at first, a little not necessarily shame, but I didn't want to promote it internally with friends and family. Like I
Mhm.
actually made it a point not to tell my parents, my brothers, our friends, because then I wanted to grow organically, right,
Yeah.
online, and
Yeah.
establish myself with folks like yourself and our peers like J Rod or Budget Dog, and in a way, it's like I wanted to have that identity first before actually promoting it, but eventually they figured it out. And I said, yeah, this was something that I wanted to try, and there's been a lot of benefit from it. But it's funny now because like my relationship, I can sense now with some friends are just like because they've given me feedback like I just don't relate to it,
Yeah.
and that's certainly a piece of feedback that I certainly take personally in a sense that like I, it gives me a feedback loop to share. Okay, well, maybe I should find other stories that are relatable. And,
Right.
um, I think the unique thing is that what I just hope that people gain from listening to my podcast, but as well as yours and many of our peers that have, content, is that you have to find the voices and stories that speak to you and make it empowers you that you can get out of whether it be debt or grow wealth, whatever the narrative and goal that you have, you should find those stories and channels that amplify that. And that's really just kind of my ambition right now. So
Yeah, and trying to find a topic that will relate to other people. I don't know if you would be as good of an interviewer. You know what I mean?
mhm.
If you're not doing it for you, if it's not something that you're enjoying.
Right. And that was the whole thing too, is, I have a 9 to 5 now, and, this podcast is still very much a COVID baby, but it is a passion. And it's like, I don't want
Mhm.
this piece as much as we see folks that are out there that are quitting their 9 to 5 to pursue coaching and their podcasts and content creation. Like I certainly have a dream of that, but right now that's not in the cards. And I'm not trying to allow this podcast for me to be a job because then it's not going to be fun. And I
Exactly.
want it to be very much something that I'm engaged with, and I have a return for myself.
Absolutely. So you mentioned that there's been some lessons that you're learning, of course, as you're interviewing people. What are some, do any stick out to you? Like a handful that you've learned?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm sure like being in sales, this podcasting has made me be a better listener and asking better questions and really getting to the root of things. I mean, we're taught in sales that we're not car salespeople, right? Like we're trying to solve problems. And in no fashion am I trying to promote that we're solving problems by interviewing our money journeys, but we're trying to connect a story and really amplify the story of that individual we're talking to. And you know, I, I'm sure, Lauren, that you know that you could just ask one question and then you can generate 20 million questions right after that, after a response. And frankly, it's been a really good lesson there. And I think the second lesson that I've learned as well is just like having empathy and listening. Just because not everyone, like, we carry a lot of bias, just as people. So I think just recognizing people where they're at and where they're trying to go has been, a lesson for me. Is just, really having empathy and patience. So
Yeah, I think part of the reason I'm able to do this at all is because I was in sales, or I've been in sales for so long, because you spend a lot of time on the phone talking to people
mhm,
or in person talking to people and taking notes and listening and putting yourself in their shoes, both personally, but definitely in their business shoes at least, right?
mhm.
And I think podcasting has made me better at sales and at listening. And I think definitely to start, sales is what made me have the ability to, podcast at all.
Can I ask you the same question, Lauren? What has podcasting done for you?
I think for me, it's forced me to be more and more authentic over time, share more and more of myself, and become more vulnerable. There are things that I've learned about specifically like cryptocurrency from Andy, or flipping from Steven, like flipping houses, or Tom with his flipping product, right?
Mhm,
I've learned some tactical things, some factual things. But what I've learned in general, I think, is to be more authentic and be more vulnerable, because this started for me very similar to what you were saying, Justin. Not like as a dirty little secret, but something that I sure wasn't telling anybody about. And I still kind
mhm,
of don't. I think some people, once they learn our net worth and where we are and what our plans are, that they may look at us a little differently. So if they find out about it, it is what it is.
mhm,
But I don't really promote it personally that much. But there's definitely a vulnerability here. I mean, telling people, what you do, what you make, what you own, right, in your portfolio, what you're doing, what the
mhm.
numbers are in your deals. It's there's a lot of vulnerability there that has been hard, but I'm learning, I think, to get a little better at it. And the spaces that our Wealth Wednesday crew is doing, or
Mhm.
that we do with Curtis every other Thursday, that has made that move exponentially faster too, because you're on the spot, right? And people are asking you specifically questions, right? And there's really no editing, right? You're live. So that has kind of sped up some of that vulnerability, I think, too.
I was going to comment there around vulnerability. I've tweeted this a lot. Is that I think within our space and that we've seen in the world is that vulnerability is now our strength. And I think the fact that you call out things like our spaces. I mean, those are places where we're the authority, right? People are listening in to gain knowledge and to gain insight. And I feel like this secret that we've probably seen within either Wall Street or people that have this wealth, it's just a matter of seeking it and finding the ones that resonate with you. Like, I'm not a real estate investor, but that's why I would go to you, right? It's just so I can seek that knowledge. Or, if we want to learn about crypto, I'm going to go to Andy, right? Like,
Yeah.
there is a networking piece, but there also is kind of meeting you where you're at. Like, I don't know about the fiat standard and Bitcoin as a standard, but I'm probably going to read those books because Steven taught me about it, right? Like, there's all these
Yep. Yep.
aspects, right? Like, where you have to just be okay and being transparent with your vulnerability, but that's also demonstrating strength as well. So,
Yeah, that's a good point. And I learned that in sales very early on. If somebody asks you a question, if a prospect asks you a question, and you don't know it, tell them you don't know it, right?
mhm,
That's actually a strong thing to do, because the easy thing to do is lie, right?
mhm,
And or to make something up, or to kind of BS them. And I've been in selling situations where people behave that way, and I literally will not do it,
mhm,
because I think if this person doesn't respect me more because I'm admitting I don't know something, then I don't know how we're going to do business together anyways.
exactly.
So we talked about your early, kind of moments that you had when you were in the $52,000 of debt. And I know you used the debt snowball to pay that off. Now you're strongly in your career, right? You've been doing this for a
Mhm.
while. What are your financial goals? I mean, you mentioned the fire movement as well. Is that something that's in the cards for you and your wife?
I'm sure anyone that goes through fire or like looks up a fire blog or looks at Mr. Money Mustache, once you read the blog or you listen to a podcast and you're like, oh, I'm all in. I'm going to save 70 or to 90% of my income and ride a bike and live on beans and rice. yeah, that's great for when you're reading it, but when you look yourself in the mirror, like you don't want to be doing that at what point. So
Yeah.
specifically, I think we've narrowed down our goals to based upon the Trinity study with the 4% rule, to have about
Mhm.
2.5 million invested,
Yep.
and mostly our investment philosophy is around index funds and maximizing things like your HSA. I invest in a Roth 401k at work. My wife has a traditional. We use the backdoor Roth method for her Roth. We have 529s for our kids. So that is our goal from just a liquidity perspective, is hitting that number. But simultaneously, one thing that we're going to be getting into is rental properties, and being in the Chicagoland area, it is competitive. So, I am going to be looking at folks like yourself or Tom at the Frugal Gay around, outside of Illinois, if you will. And that's going to be a fun journey for me. I think the one aspect that we have to figure out for ourselves is, I think the harder question that we have to ask is the RE part of FIRE is, what does retire early mean, and and how does that translate for what my wife and I do? We have two young boys, and call it cliche, but we do want to spend more engaged time with them. And if saving more is going to be the trick to do that, then that's totally fine with us. But I'm not here to tell folks listening that like you should up and leave your job to follow your passion or do anything like that to retire early. But within the job that you have now, is really just try to find the joy within your life and joy within the work that you do. Like I do love my job. I love my company, but I recognize too that, I have to establish my financial boundaries first, just so I have a little bit more freedom to do what I want later. So I don't know if I answered your question there, but so I kind of went on a little bit of a rant there.
Yeah,
So
no, that nails it. I mean, that's very straightforward. And that's the beauty of index funds. Like
Mhm.
it's very straight. You're like, I need 2.5 million and then I can have 100,000 per year. And that's very straightforward. You start wait till you mix the rentals in there. You'll start being like, okay, if I get this much cash flow from the rentals, then how much do I need in the index funds? And do I apply the 4% rule to the rentals? It kind of makes it a little more complicated. But what Justin was talking about there, and we've talked about this before, but in case you're new here, there's something called the Trinity study, and what it says is you can safely withdraw with like 99% success 4% from a portfolio every single year. And the idea being your portfolio is probably growing by more than that, right? And in the years that it falls, you've had enough growth that you can still take 4% out and live off of that. So 2.5 million, I think, is $100,000 when we're talking about the
Mhm.
4% rule,
Yep. Yep.
which is
Definitely.
our goal too. That's a nice round number, $100,000. But for the retire early, we may at that point continue to work and maybe work for lifestyle and then
Mhm.
increase generosity also at that point.
Totally. And there's this thing called barista fire, and things of that nature. I do love coffee. I'm like J Rod, where like we joke about opening up our own coffee shop one day, and that to me is fun. I think there's also the aspect of healthcare. I don't know what that's going to necessarily look like for us in the future, but I think the beauty that I want to convey to your listeners is the fact that, like, if you just start now, you're going to have a lot more options later. You really will. You really are. Like, if you invest now and just recognize you have an intentional plan, whether it's going to be, being outrageously generous with your wealth, or, finding a way to give to charity or anything like that, like, you're going to have options, which you probably don't see now, but you will have at the end of your journey.
It does start really slow. I
Hmm.
remember, we're going down memory lane back to, when I was early 20s. And it's like I would check my 401k, and my dad was like, check it twice a year. I'm like, okay, that sounds fair, right? And so I would check it, like, it went up just what? That's it? That's all it did? I feel like I've been working so hard or whatever. But
Yeah.
really, truly, like the longer you're in this, like we're talking about, I bought my first house in 2012, right? This is now 2022. My husband and I are worth well over $1 million. And that
Hmm.
was from zero, like less than 10 years ago, right? So but it didn't start like that. It was like worth zero and then worth 10,000 and then worth 20,000, right? And then worth
Hmm.
100,000. Like you have to take all of those steps and it does start building and it does speed up over time. And speaking of shame, right? Just because you should have started sooner doesn't mean you shouldn't start now, right?
Hmm.
Forgive yourself, right? Forgive yourself for the credit card debt and the nice cars and the house in the in the golf course community and I'll forgive yourself for the BMW like me, right? Forgive yourself for those things and just start now. And you can start small, but just start. There's no reason to put it off. But you need to forgive yourself for any financial mistakes that you've made and then just get started. And also, like most people, I think the listeners kind of like, it's like a bell curve and they peak at 27. So I don't think any of you all, for the most part, are thinking you're too old, but you're not too old. There's plenty of accounts out there on Twitter that are, in their 50s or whatever, or Evelyn, I've been interacting with a lot
Hmm.
lately, and, people that are over 40 and they're getting going. There's no reason, just because you should have started sooner doesn't mean you shouldn't start now. I mean, what are you going to do? Right? Are you going to work forever? Are you going to stay unhappy in a job? Right? Like that's just something that I was thinking about as you were talking, Justin.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, and appreciate, Lauren, that we that is a message that we need to have, is that there's no like there's a time and a place to be, have that victim mentality, be like, yes, I should have done this, I should have done that, but forgive yourself, move on, and let's find a plan. And now is the best time to be an investor, right? There's so many things within technology and apps and different styles of investing. You could do real estate, you could do NFTs and crypto, but be a student, continue to be curious and to refine it. I advocate, do the traditional things first, right? Get a 401k, get out of debt, get an emergency fund, do those foundational pieces first, and then you can broaden out and buy 50 ape NFTs or the whatever the cool trend is, right? But find yourself a basis first, and then you can explore and place those asymmetric bets.
Absolutely. So, other than listening to the Road to Wealth podcast, what are some ways that people can continue to learn?
Well, I would also promote the Adulting is Easy podcast. I think that's a fine podcast with the host. I think her name's Lauren.
Good one.
No, but I think there's find the ones that speak to you. There's several out there. I subscribe to a ton of money podcasts. The ones that are the big ones that I've listened to that I've actually recently loved is Ramit Sethi's podcast. I Will Teach You to Be Rich. He just started that late last year, and the unique thing with his, it's a different format where he actually gets a couple together to talk about their money problems. And I mean, some of these people have like $10 million in net worth, Lauren, and they're fighting over blueberries, the cost of blueberries, or an Amazon, I'm serious, like an Amazon Audible subscription, and they have a
Oh, I
$10
got
million
it.
net worth.
Is this my future? Is this my future? It might be. It might be.
Just make sure blueberries aren't a part of it, like organic frozen blueberries. Apparently, that's been a theme on Ramit's
Oh my
podcast.
God, that's so funny.
But yeah, there's also things like audiobooks that you can look into. JL Collins' book is the one that resonated with me, and as well as Ramit's. Go on Twitter Spaces. I mean, find different finance people, even if you follow a few hashtags on Instagram or Twitter. I think, especially for the younger listeners that are out there, I mean, those are different areas that you could find, because you have so many different financial personalities that are putting creative content together. Like, I literally have a friend named Chloe Clobear. If you're not following her, she literally twerks and puts financial things like how to open up a Roth IRA on her Instagram, which is crazy. There's several out there that will speak your language of understanding, and just try to find the one that speaks to you is my piece of advice. So
I love that. That's great. And I am a huge reader. I've never listened to an audiobook. I probably should. I spend a lot of my listening time listening to a true crime podcasts.
No, I
Believe it or
love it.
not.
I love it.
So, but some of the books, you're right, like The Simple Path to Wealth, I Will Teach You to Be Rich, are great. Speaking of couples, I also liked Smart Couples Finish Rich. I read that kind of as informational. Your Money or Your Life is a great one.
Yep.
Set for Life, great book that's got a real estate house hacking tilt to it. And Psychology of Money, that's a relatively new one. So those are some books that I would recommend. That's just like you just said, Justin, find what works for you. I like reading. So what am I going to do? The first thing I'm going to do is turn to those books. And I did that when I got into real estate as well. I did listen to the Bigger Pockets podcast for a while, but really I just voraciously read like all of their books. So yeah, just keep learning, keep growing. The more you learn, the more you realize you don't know, I feel like, but it's still worth doing. There's so many cool people out there that are experts, right? Like we've mentioned a few, especially like the Twitter quote unquote like personalities or accounts, I guess, where they really are experts. And they're also, what I think is very cool, generous with their time. and they
Yes.
will answer your questions, right? Like that's been pretty cool and pretty eye-opening for me for like the last 6 months to a year or so.
Yeah. If there's one thing I want to leave your listeners, if that's the demographic, Lauren, that you're saying is around that 27, age bracket and, bell curve, I'd say ask a lot of questions, be curious. People will be very generous with their time. And the one thing about like that I had a misconception first with wealthy people is that they were unapproachable. People that are wealthy sometimes are just kind of hidden in the background. Is just ask those questions, be transparent, be open. And I think there's a lot of learning to do. And keep in mind, personal finance is just something that you will continually learn and develop and mold over time. So it's a never ending race.
It is. It is, but it's definitely a worthwhile one, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So, anything else to add before we wrap up?
No, I'd plug, just because we're kind of in that, time frame for us is that, Lauren and I are on a bunch of different, spaces online. I'd encourage you to, especially if this is resonating with you, is, tune into those because I think those are live and you can kind of get us off the cuff. But yeah, definitely find the one that resonates with you. Make a plan. I recently had a tweet today about like cash cushion within your checking account, like small things like that. You can get as specific as that, or even long-term goals of what you want to do. I think just having a financial plan. Just because we're recording right now in January, my wife and I always go through like how we set our goals for the year, and definitely have a financial goal. I think that's certainly something, outside of health or professionally, that's something you definitely want to incorporate within yourself every year. So that's just what I want to share.
Agreed. Agreed. Managing money is a huge part of adulting, and a little bit of knowledge can go a really long way. Justin, why don't you tell people how to get in touch with you?
Yeah, thanks, Lauren, for having me on again. You could find me on Twitter. I'm at the Road to Wealth Pod. On Instagram, I'm also at the Road to Wealth Podcast. And you could obviously listen to my podcast as well as the episode I recorded with Lauren in season 2 last year, at the Road to Wealth Podcast, wherever podcasts are found.
Awesome. So you guys can follow me on Twitter at Adulting is Easy. I'm also on Facebook. You can email me. Email me your questions, comments, feedback, any topics you want to see covered to realadultingiseasy@gmail.com. You can show support at patreon.com/adultingiseasy. And we've mentioned spaces a couple of times. The one that I'm on weekly is called Wealth Wednesday. Weekly at 9:30 Eastern. We've covered real estate, tokenized real estate, crypto, quitting your 9 to 5, increasing your income, and so much more. And you can see some of those recordings. Actually, all of those recordings are on this feed as well. Thanks again for listening, everybody. Hopefully, we've made adulting a little easier for you.